So let's move on now to a Q&A from you, the viewers. And our first question comes in from the last Ginyu, who had a good point about Chromebooks, that Google is basically going to support Chromebooks for 6.5 years from the time that Chromebook is first released. And then after that, it will no longer get updates, even if the computer is still perfectly functional. And one of the beauties of Chrome OS is that you don't need a very high-end computer to get a good experience out of it. My mom's been using a low-end Chromebook for a number of years now, and I think she's probably getting close to the end of life on her perfectly useful computer. And he makes a good point here about the Samsung Chromebook 3. It was made in 2015, but if you bought it in 2018, the updates will stop in 2020 regardless. And I went over to the Chromebook auto update policy site, which you can see linked down here. They've got a list of every Chromebook that's on the market and when the support will end for it. And sure enough, you can go out right now and buy yourself a Samsung Chromebook 3 with 4 gigs of RAM and 16 gigs of storage, a very capable Chromebook. But if you bought that now, you will no longer be able to get updates on that Chromebook in about 3 years. So you won't have the full 6.5 years, even though you bought the Chromebook right now. You're going to get about 3 or so, and that's just based on how they calculate this end of life. And I can understand why. It's probably a lot to support a lot of different hardware types, so they probably want to move on when those computers stop selling. It's probably not very profitable to support a $188 computer over a long period of time. I was also reading in some of the fine print that this might actually apply to the first hardware type of that particular Chromebook when it's released. So some of these generic brands we've seen, maybe they just get released now, but the hardware platform was released 2 or 3 years prior, and that would shorten the life of that Chromebook as well. This is going to be a problem, I think, as more consumers begin adopting Chromebooks. I am seeing this both in my personal experiences with people that I know, but also with the amount of attention my Chromebook videos have been getting here lately. There's a lot of people shopping for these things, and this might be a rude wake-up call if they find out that the computer they just bought is no longer supported. So we'll have to see if Google changes their strategy on this as time goes on. Then I was curious, what do other manufacturers do? So it looks like Apple runs on a similar schedule, believe it or not. So if you look at macOS Mojave, the latest version of macOS, they support the mid-2012 MacBook Pro or later, not earlier. So if you have a computer that's about 7 years old, you will not be installing Mojave on it. My father has a iMac, an older one that he got about 8 or 10 years ago. It still works just fine. But because it is too old for Mojave, he's not going to be getting the new OS. It's still getting some updates, but that will probably end at some point. So, you know, it's still usable, but he's got himself now a useless paperweight and a nice display that he can't use with anything else. So there you go. So Apple is kind of following a similar trend with much more expensive hardware. Now, Windows is a very different story. Now, of course, hardware is different than software, so yes, the computer you bought 20 years ago is probably not going to get any updates for BIOS vulnerabilities or other hardware issues, but if the hardware is working and it meets these very minimum requirements, you will likely get that computer to work with Windows 10. Windows 10 requires only a 1 gigahertz processor. You need 1 gigabyte of RAM if you're running the 32-bit version of Windows, which is still supported. You can even get it going on an 800 by 600 display. Probably won't be the most fun way to operate a computer, but it's still supported by Microsoft. And I think if you look back at Microsoft's history, they've probably supported legacy hardware better than just about any software maker out there. That's starting to change now with Windows 10. They're now pushing people to using virtual machines for really old Windows software. But for a while, the oldest Windows software would run on a relatively modern Windows operating system. So just a little food for thought here on how different computers in the industry will be supported over time. If you plan on buying a computer now and not getting another one for 10 or 15 years, maybe Windows is the better way to go. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention open source alternatives. So you can, of course, find some really low-impact Linux installations that can install on those Windows PCs. If you decide Windows isn't your thing anymore, that's going to be a little more difficult on a Chromebook just because they really lock down what you can install on it. But you might have some success running a Linux operating system on an old Mac. So there are some options out there for some of that aging hardware if you don't want to do the Windows thing.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Chris Allegretta, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, Anuj Zaveri, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.